Might get one.
Yeah, we should, so we, that's not gonna kind of get us and go in the middle of the session. Oh, yeah, sure. Folks, we'll probably wait just a couple more minutes, see if a few more people trickle in, and then we can get started. Okay, I might get us started. Do we need to hit the
We did already.
it's already.
Yeah.
Okay. So, hi everyone, my name is Jeremy Kolitz. I'm a researcher from the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. I do applied research on WASH in the Asia Pacific region, around equitable WASH service delivery, but primarily around climate change and WASH. My doctoral research, I guess, was back in 2015, 2018. My PhD was on climate change impacts on rural water services, and since then, been doing a lot of research to expand that to urban sanitation and rural sanitation contexts as well. I'm joined by Diana Gonzalez-Botero and Avni Kumar, who are also researchers at the University of Technology, Sydney. So real quickly, I guess I'm going to describe this side event to you in a nutshell, because I realize if this is all you've seen, indicators of climate risk, you're probably wondering what exactly this is about, because indicators can mean a lot of things. When I mean indicators, what we're referring to here is indicators for WASH service authorities, so primarily subnational governments, and indicators for flagging climate risks. So that is when an indicator is indicating that a climate risk is too high, that subnational government should act on that. So these are not indicators per se, like an M&E indicators for like evaluating a program. They're not JMP kind of indicators for monitoring progress or allocating resources or anything like that. And they are for subnational governments, so there's quite simple indicators. Yesterday, I was at a session run by JMP, and they talked about indicators, and they're using machine learning and things to develop things, and nothing that sophisticated, much more simple, things that local governments in low and middle income countries could use. And you might have noticed that some sessions, some tend to be a bit more presentation heavy and sort of giving information, and some are a bit more interactive. This is going to be a bit more of an interactive discussion based one, although I do have some presentations. So just to let you know up front, that's what we're going to be focused on. Won't hurt my feeling if anyone gets up and wants to change sessions now, if that wasn't what you were expecting. But please do stay, because I think it will be interesting. Well, yeah, I can manually change it like this.
Yeah.
Okay. So give a little bit of background where this side event is coming from. So the work that this came out of is via the Water for Women Fund, which is a fund delivered by the Australian government, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or DFAT. And great, thank you. And the Water for Women Fund's been going on since 2018, and I think this year was its last year, and it aimed to improve WASH and gender and social inclusion outcomes in the Asia Pacific region. And it recently received a 2-year extension from DFAT, and DFAT said in the extension, we want all of these projects under this fund to focus on climate resilience. So this includes both implementation projects by NGOs or civil society organizations and by research organizations. And in preparation for the extension phase, in which all of the programs are meant to focus on climate resilience, they developed this learning agenda, where they commissioned us to look at knowledge and practice gaps in climate resilient inclusive WASH, in order to identify what work needs to be done to fill certain practice and knowledge gaps in the next 2 years. So that was put together in a report. If you're interested, that's the bit.ly link there if you want to write it down or take a photo and look at it later, and that'll take you to the PDF. But as part of that study, we interviewed and did surveys of the partners of the fund, which is about 15 CSOs and research organizations. And also we did surveys of multilaterals like ADB and UNICEF and WHO, and asked them about what they were focusing on in terms of climate resilient WASH, and what did they see as the gaps. And there was quite a few, there's quite a lot of work to be done in this space. But one of them that came up was around monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And a lot of CSOs noted that they don't really have a method for integrating climate risk or mainstreaming it into their MEL processes. That governments that they worked with minimally were considering climate risks. And a lot of the multilaterals said it was a priority for them to have more in the space of MEL. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of different ways to think about how climate change is relevant for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And in this piece of work and in this side event, it's this idea of indicators for some national governments to think about how they can detect emerging environmental change and how they can proactively implement responses for WASH services rather than being reactive and kind of in an ad hoc way reacting to the changes in environment. So why more indicators? It's a good question. We already want governments to be monitoring things around JMP. There's different interests. There was one yesterday I was at, we're trying to get people, governments to monitor menstrual hygiene management. So it's kind of like more indicators for government to look after in environments where they have scarce time and resources to do so. But the reason why we think it's important is of course, I'm sure you know that climate change is driving continual and uncertain change in the environment, and that this is going to go on for the foreseeable future. Unless you're really optimistic, we're probably not going to limit global warming to 2 degrees. We're probably going to blow past that by quite a bit. And 2 degrees, of course, is the mark at which climate scientists and other experts feel that there's going to be catastrophic and an irreversible environmental change. And we know statistically, we can prove that there already are significant changes in the environment in terms of extreme precipitation events and extreme heat in most regions of the world, and in drought in some regions of the world. And anecdotally and personally, you might be noticing it as well in your own lives. I work in Sydney, Australia, and Sydney typically gets 1,200 millimeters of rain per year. I think we're at 2,500 millimeters this year, and we have a good chance of pushing towards 3,000 millimeters of rain this year. And that's in line with projections that say Sydney's going to get wetter and wetter in the future. So of course, all of these changes, more intense rainfall events, extreme weather, that drives changes in the hydrology of the environment. So the natural water cycle, how much water is falling from the sky, how much is getting absorbed into the ground, how much is evaporating. And of course, that all has implications for WASH. The prevailing kind of thinking on resilience for WASH, especially at local levels, is that we need to be a bit adaptive and flexible in the ways that we do things. We can predict certain things about climate change. We can say with a high level of confidence that it's getting warmer, that sea levels are going to rise. But things like precipitation, especially in the Asia Pacific region, are really hard to predict. If you look at climate projections, I'm most familiar with Asia Pacific, but you'll often see them saying, well, rainfall might increase 30%, might go down 30%. It could do anything in between. They don't really know. And that's at a regional level. And then at local levels, there's even more uncertainty. And then there's more complexity about, well, even if it rains more, if it rains less, how is that going to affect water resources locally? Because it also depends on things like land use activities and water demand. So it's really hard to know what's going to happen. So the best thing you can do in uncertain situations is to have a mindset or a culture of continually learning, of observing and monitoring the context, and then responding to that as quickly as you can. So having indicators helps with that. If we have a system of where we can be constantly looking at the environment, detecting the way it's changing, and then be proactively on top of that, that's one way we can handle this uncertainty. Some of the good news is that the indicators that I'm going to talk about today and the monitoring is, it depends on the context, but I think we're going to see this as we go through the activities today, that data availability is really variable in different countries. But a lot of the data that I think we would need for monitoring climate risks is already available. The indicators that I'm going to talk about are quite simple. They're just things like rainfall. Is there anyone measuring rainfall in your country? Is anyone measuring groundwater levels? That's different. Some countries do it, some don't. The other good thing is that these types of indicators are useful for all types of sectors. It's not just WASH. So I mean, agriculture, even like energy, food security, they're all interested in knowing what's going to happen to the water cycle as well. So other sectors are probably interested in collecting this data and may already be doing it as well. Especially the agriculture sectors, they're really interested in drought indicators and things like that. So hopefully what we're talking about is not developing new processes where we need local government authorities who have scarce resources to begin with to go out and collect more data, but that it's about looking for data sources that are already available and then getting government to use those and make use of that data. So a bit about the learning agenda activity. So I mentioned that Water for Women sort of backed this study. This wasn't a big multi-year study. It was a desktop study, and it was done entirely within this year. And what we did, and by we, I mean the University of Technology, Sydney, the International Water Center at Griffith University, WaterAid, and IDE. We worked on this together. We did this process of, first, we identified some climate hazards to work with. So climate hazards being things that could disrupt WASH. So the 6 that we focused on were droughts, flooding, extreme weather events. I'll give a little more detail on that later. Groundwater rise, sea level rise, and extreme heat. And from that, we listed a non-comprehensive list of risks to household WASH access. So by risks, I mean, in what ways would a drought or a flood disrupt water sanitation and hygiene? We just focused on household access because mainly as a scoping decision. You could think of many, many ways in which climate could affect a centralized sanitation facility or emptying services and all sorts of things. But we stuck with household access, and we stuck with risks that were relevant to JMP indicators. And again, part of that was a scoping decision, just to try not to address everything under the sun, but also because local governments are already being asked to monitor JMP indicators. So we were trying to tie the risks JMP indicators in hopes that it would be a bit more attractive to wash service authorities. We identified this list of risks. I'm giving a couple examples of what those look like. And then we identified simple environmental indicators, mainly natural environment, but some built environment indicators that would indicate to a wash service authority, like a local government, that this climate risk, the likelihood of this climate risk was rising. And I'll give an example here in a moment. And then finally, we tried to look at what data sources are available generally to countries to monitor these indicators. It's really variable across countries. It sort of depends on what's available in each country. So we just came up with some generic examples. So this is all going to be put into an output that'll be published later this year. And the idea is it's sort of a menu of indicators and risks, and it's sort of reference material. But the idea is that subnational governments and their CSO partners could choose amongst this sort of menu of options and say, well, we want to monitor these risks or use these indicators, and then it'll give some guidance on implementing those. So what that's going to look like, I'm sorry if that text is a bit too small to read, but I'll go through it anyway. So it's like a menu of tables like this, where there's an example of a climate risk at the top. So this one says, toilets cannot be used because seawater, floodwater causes backflow through outlets or inundates toilets. Consequently, people use unsafe alternative sanitation facilities or practice open defecation. So this might be more relative in an urban, para-urban context where people have toilets flushing into a septic tank or maybe to a drain or something. And where there's a storm surge or there's flooding, it could cause the outlets to back up. So the indicators of that risk, so how do we know that risk that might actually happen? Simple indicators, forecasted high tides combined with storm activity. So those are the conditions for storm surges. If you're in a coastal environment, if you know that it's high tide on this day and there's a storm incoming, that there's a risk of a storm surge. Forecasted pluvial or fluvial flooding events, if the government already has a way of forecasting that. And then the third indicator is proportion of sanitation facilities that are located in areas that we know are exposed to things like storm surges and flooding. So again, these are things that, not in all contexts, but in many contexts, people might already be monitoring these types of things. So we're saying that if there's a forecasted high tide and there's storm activity, and you know there's sanitation facilities in the coastal areas, you can say there's a high risk that water might intrude and might cause toilets to back up. So if you're forecasting these things, you should proactively take some action to mitigate this risk. Then has some other information just about the corresponding JMP indicators that it's most linked to, relevant climate hazards, the geographical context, the wash modality, which just means what kind of wash service or wash technology is this risk most relevant for. And then at the bottom, example adaptation options. So what might you do in response if you detect this risk? Just to note that we're going to focus mainly on the indicators today. We're not going to talk much about the adaptations. That's a whole other ball of wax, is what do you actually do to solve the problem. That needs a whole other side of it to discuss. Real quickly, another example of a climate risk. Extreme heat and humidity makes fetching water dangerous. Consequently, people suffer from heat-related illness or collect less water than needed. Women and girls are disproportionately affected in areas where they are primarily responsible for water collection. So that's the risk. You might forecast this by looking at the indicators. You might look at forecasted events of extreme heat and humidity in areas where a high proportion of people are collecting water from distant sources, if you have that data. Another indicator is proportion of households without substantial storage of water at home. So if they don't have the water stored at home and they need to collect it offsite. So again, if you can forecast it's going to be very hot, very humid, you know that people collect water from distant sources in this area, you know they don't store water, then you can say, well, this risk is quite high. We should proactively do something about that, like put out a warning on the radio just to let people know it's going to be really hot. You might collect your water early in the morning, or you might collect it the day before and store it, something like that. So Diana and Avni are going to pass out lists of the indicators, sort of a draft list of the indicators on these worksheets. There's only 30 copies. So if you came with a friend, please just maybe share one. Alternatively, there's a QR code if you want to look at the Google Doc version of it, but it might be easier to have the paper copy in front of you. And today we're going to look at the indicators that appear in that output. We're not going to look at all that list of climate risks. Oops, I'm sorry if you're using the QR code. There's lots of climate risks, but I want to focus on the indicators today. So the indicators in the sheets are they're not tied to any climate risks, but they represent climate risks in the output that we're going to be publishing. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. Let's give a minute just for people to get the sheets or to take use the link. So, thank you. Okay, so we're going to look at these indicators in the group work. But as you can take a quick look right now, and you can see they're all quite simple indicators. There's nothing super sophisticated here. In the group work, we're going to talk about where you might collect data or what data sources are available in your country or a country context that you're familiar with to monitor those indicators. And we'll have like small groups discussions around that. And I think what we'll find is in different country contexts, it's very variable. Some countries have a lot of data sources and some don't. The data sources for those indicators can come from many places. In some cases, there's global databases. There's increasingly a number of data portals where you have like a university or some research institute or some other organization that at a global level monitors things like drought events or cyclones. So those can be useful. A cyclone can be managed or monitored from a global level, and that would be locally relevant. There's national data sets, for example, meteorology departments that have websites that put up forecasts and things. And then there's subnational data, for example, things like what a district office might know in terms of just surveying households just in their district. In addition to that, so I mentioned global databases, national databases, and sort of formal subnational monitoring. There's other sources of knowledge or data, which include traditional ecological knowledge, citizen science approaches, just the tacit knowledge of people. I mean, ideally, you would like to have formally kind of collected data, especially if you want indicators and thresholds, you want quantitative data. But realistically, in a lot of contexts, that's not going to be available. And you might just have to rely on sort of the experience and tacit knowledge of people to make a judgment call. Ideally, we want to focus on information that's already being collected and already being held, rather than asking subnational government to go out and collect primary data. But if the government's really invested and really keen to do it, they can also do their own primary data collection. But feasibly, in most cases, they're not going to have the money or the interest to go out and collect more data. So a few practicality considerations. Again, as mentioned, the capacity, the willingness of national government to monitor things. Again, they don't necessarily need to collect it themselves, but they do need to have access to it. So if it's on a global or a national database, they have to have the capability to access that website and the know-how to draw data from it. In some cases, their adequacy of the monitoring programs, of course, refers to whether the data you're getting is any good. So in some countries, the rainfall data is really poor. I remember in Vanuatu, it has all these gaps, and it goes for months because the rainfall gauge fell over and no one checked on it. So then when you look at the records, there's a big gap in it. Coordination and collaboration and data sharing arrangements. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of other sectors are interested in these indicators and you might want to get the data from them. But depending on the country context, as you know, sometimes there's rivalries between ministries and they don't want to share the data that they collected and things like that. So that can throw up a barrier. And then analysis for data, there's actually not a lot of analysis, I think, because again, these indicators are quite simple, so that they shouldn't require a huge amount of analyses. And then a process for actually acting or alerting communities, kind of the next step that we'll talk about in a bit. So what we're going to do now, for about the 20-30 minutes, is we're going to try to find a way to put us into 3 groups. The room isn't super conducive for group work. Also, we have a sort of a big group. We might try to make it 4. But what we're doing is you have the indicator list. There's 6 categories. So one group is going to look at 2 sets of categories. So one will look at drought and extreme heat. One will look at flooding and extreme events. And the third will look at sea level rise, groundwater level rise. And first, we'll just do a little bit of quiet time. And what we want you to do is think about your country context or a country context you're familiar with, and try to think of where might you get the data to monitor the indicators in your categories. So do you know of meteorology departments? Do you know of national databases or local authorities that might have information that subnational government could access? And primarily focusing on data that already exists rather than setting up new processes, but if you can't think of anything, you can set up some new ones. And then also to think about how feasible would it be for local government in your context to monitor those indicators. Do you think it's feasible, or do you think for some of these indicators like groundwater ones, you're like, no way, there's no information, they're not going to be able to monitor this. So what we might do is, so Diana and Avni are going to facilitate one. So maybe Diana, you can do sort of the front half of this group. And Avni try to collect people, put in the back. And I'll round people around here in the front.
We're doing 4 groups. Yeah.
Try to do 3 or 4 groups. So if you guys, you might like to turn your chairs around. Maybe from like here forwards. It's one group. Groundwater is sea level rise. Is anyone in a landlocked country?
Let's get out. Online. Let's see how that looks.
Everyone's country context post.
Okay.
All right, thanks, everyone. We're gonna do a bit of a report back from each one of the groups. Avni, Diana, and our new facilitator Cindy is going to help with a bit of a report back. So my group, we looked at droughts and extreme heat, and just a few high-level thoughts from my group that I would like to share. We've covered a lot of ground actually in different contexts. But one thing that is apparent is that there's not a lot of great data availability for the indicators that we had in our group. And so the implications of that is one, that we might only be able to select a few priority indicators where we do think we can access the data for that. But to think beyond, I guess, just government sources, that some data might be more readily available within non-governmental organizations. So kind of major institutions that are working in the area. Could even be private sector agencies that might actually be monitoring things like groundwater level, where we don't expect the government to be doing that at all. There was a comment to mention that the indicators as listed in themselves are probably not clear enough to actually monitor. So we're going to talk a little bit more about thresholds. So say if there's not enough rainfall, what's not enough actually mean in your context? And also even things like extreme heat or extreme precipitation, what is extreme? So there is a bit more work to do to operationalize these indicators, which they're kind of written in layman's terms right now. Another comment that came up is that in these contexts where you don't have quantitative data, that we might need to rely a bit on the sort of tacit knowledge or experience of the people working in local areas, and that we shouldn't wait until really good quantitative data is available on the things that we like. Ideally, we'd like to have the best data in the world, but we should start to think about how can we forecast, monitor, respond to things with what's there. And what's there might not be the greatest data. Again, it might just be people's personal experiences and their knowledge, sort of qualitative type things like that. But that might be enough to go on in lieu of better data. I guess, Diana, could you share?
Thank you. My name is Diana Gonzalez. I work with Jeremy at the Institute for Sustainable Futures as well. And my group, we were discussing groundwater level rise indicators and sea level rise indicators, and didn't make it through the whole list of sea level rise indicators. It was too much to go through, and yeah, had a lot of discussions around different ones. But some key insights from our group. I think, first of all, I just want to mention that we had so much diversity in the countries and the context that we were discussing. We had people who were familiar with context in Cambodia and Papua New Guinea, Bangladesh, Australia, South Pacific Island countries, Ghana, Ethiopia, Mozambique. So it was very, very diverse. And these indicators apply to different extents to the context of each country. But what we discussed was that the groundwater data seemed to be harder to access. It wasn't as readily available in all the contexts. And we thought that it was also more expensive to get access, so to monitor and to eventually get access to, compared to sea level water data that was something that was more visible and probably feels more urgent in some circumstances, and was probably also cheaper to monitor. So we expect it would be also more readily available. We also talked a lot about data and where we could get different types of data from, and we talked about different contexts or sectors. We talked about mining, for example, for groundwater, and for types of soil and geological institutes or departments. We talked about fisheries, meteorological organizations, agriculture, and we also talked about indigenous and local, or that tacit knowledge, particularly I think we mentioned in the South Pacific Island countries, where sea level rise is something that is very much at the forefront of people's lives and just your everyday experiences. And even though data might not be very good in terms of quantitative data quality in those places, it is something that people are very much aware about, and is, I think, similar to what you discussed, Jeremy. And I think one last point from us is that we thought that predicting or the forecast data was harder to get, and how far ahead do you have to predict to be able to say this is useful data or not? Data in the more immediate sort of time was more available than forecast, particularly for groundwater or for sea level rise and rainfall. So I hope I captured our group's discussion as well. So thanks so much for sharing.
Thanks, Deanna. Another point I wanted to bring up for my group, sorry, I just remembered that we were talking about a new information management system that would be setting up in the country for WASH. And there was a point about how we could advocate if there is a new management system coming up and we have indicators that we think would be really good for climate risk to advocate to say, can we include an indicator in this new management information system that we think would be really useful for tracking environmental risks. Thanks. So I'll bring up Avnia.
Hi, everyone. So my group talked about flooding and extreme weather events. Some of the common points that came up in our discussion was a lot of the high-level indicators on forecasted weather events are available in with disaster management authorities or meteorological data. And the issue is more about translating that or translating that information and data to WASH departments, and how can WASH officials and people working in the WASH sector interpret that data for their context. So it's more about lack of institutional coordination rather than lack of data in some of the initial indicators. There was a point raised about different learning from other sectors. So for example, the agricultural sector and how they're using climate data to predict the risks to agricultural activity, and maybe the WASH sector can learn some lessons from that and how to translate high level climate risk data to their context. So then we did touch upon how can we address the issue of lack of institutional coordination. Didn't really land on a solution, but there were some ideas floating around about setting up like a new department at the national level with representatives from different ministries with that sort of have some motivation and a common agenda for that department to be able to move this work forward. There was some discussion on indicators that might not be available because as we know, climate change is unpredictable, and often there are risks or events that occur which are not predicted. For example, like a certain road being impassable during flood risk events, which people weren't aware about. So there are these new risks that come up, and how can we kind of capture those that information and that knowledge, and then use that in future to prepare and adapt in a more robust manner, help communities. I hope I captured everything from our group discussion. Thanks very much, everyone, for sharing.
Thanks, Cindy. Could I ask you to apologies to Cindy. I made her an impromptu facilitator. Bigger group than I expected. But thanks very much, Cindy, for doing this on very short notice.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm Cindy, not from UTS, from Universitas Indonesia. We will be working together. So we had the flooding indicators and extreme events. And for forecasted events, I think in general for flooding and extreme events, data are available. And we talked that in there were most researchers were from the US, and there were available online historical data around flooding, which is in other cases we had people from Rwanda, Philippines, and myself from Indonesia or Brazil. These historical data were not available. So when we talk about forecasting, it would determine the accuracy of these forecasts. And some people also talked about how the current forecasting models are not as accurate, even with accurate historical data because with all the sea level rise affecting flooding, etc. And some specific data on, for example, road or paths between communities that become impassable when heavy precipitation occurs, or sanitation facilities prone to storm surges. Those are also, of course, not available. But we talked about different exercises, how we can overlay maps of contour maps and wash facilities. But then, yeah, what are the accuracy of these data? One person had an experience from the Philippines, and she mentioned how the data are dispersed within 5 ministries. So yes, I think consolidating the data is really important. But maybe talking from my experience in Indonesia, we have a national disaster management agency, but they don't collect wash related data. So I think that's maybe also important to discuss. Some bottom-up data such as water storage containers at home. That's interesting, and experience from Brazil is that it's mandatory in Brazil to have water storage at home. But when we talk about informal settlements, that's where we should ensure that these water storage also exist. And we can collaborate with community hygiene facilitators or sanitarians, for the case in Indonesia, which is usually grouped under MOH, Ministry of Health. So you also add on top of that another ministry that is related to these extreme events. So I think, yeah, the other groups talk about data management. I think that's also important to see how wash related indicators can be consolidated within that data. Yeah, I think, one more thing, maybe, because we're also very related to flooding that's to sea level rise as well. There's a lot of talk about contour maps, and at the moment, a lot of the readily available contour maps have a low level accuracy, like only 0 or 5 meters and nothing in between. And when we talk about sea level rise, it's a few centimeters, and it's not something we can predict with with existing contour maps. So it's also something to consider. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone for that, for your participation in those groups.
Just check the chat, see if there's anything. in there.
Yeah, nothing in the
Cool.
chat.
Richard.
And thanks to the facilitators for reporting back. So I mean, some next steps. So this was basically just a thinking exercise to sort of think about what's possible. What could we potentially begin to think about monitoring? But of course, there's lots of work to be done to actually operationalize this and set this up. You're not going to take your sheet of paper here and go to the subnational government and start recording things. So some key steps amongst probably some others that I think would need to be taken from here is, one is to prioritize indicators. So we got that sheet there, and there's I don't know, something like 40 indicators there. And you've probably seen in your groups a lot of the responses. Well, we don't have any data related to a lot of these things. So realistically, a government would probably have to prioritize a set number of indicators. So thinking about what's most relevant in your context, what risks are really affecting people that you would really like to know about and be able to act upon, and what could be feasibly done in your context. A big one is to think about defining the thresholds for action. So as we mentioned earlier, that we're talking about the groundwater level is too low, or precipitation is reduced, or it's heightened. How much is too low, or how much is not enough? And there's no way to sort of generically say like a 25% decrease is bad. It really depends on the local context. So you really probably need to do some kind of study of to define a threshold, to say this is when it's problematic and we need to act. Study could range from something, ideally, of course, if you had all the resources and money, you'd go out and collect data, and you'd do descriptive or advanced statistics and say, when it rains this much, we know contamination levels go up by this much. I've seen, and if a research organization comes along with money, they could do that. I know, I think it's part of the REACH program, I think, in Katrina Charles, they're doing something with water safety planning. And they're actually collecting that data, and they say, we know in this time of year, when it rains this much, the water supplies tend to get contaminated, so that's when you should go out and do water quality monitoring. So if someone comes along and does a study with that, that's great. Obviously, in a lot of contexts, you won't have those resources, and it has to be a bit more publicly qualitative, asking people, do people tend to get sick when it rains this much? Or people might know, well, it typically floods when the water, when the river, the level in the river is this high. So it's a bit just more experiential. As I mentioned earlier, we have to work with what we've got. We probably shouldn't just sit around and wait for the perfect data to come along. Identifying vulnerable groups, I think, is important because risk is not the same for everyone. Certain people will be impacted more and certain people will be at higher levels of risk. Some feedback we got on this project early on was where are the social indicators? Like, how do we know who are the most vulnerable people? And I think indicators are not in my opinion, they're not the best for measuring social vulnerability. I think indicators work best in predictable situations when you can say, if it doesn't rain this much, we're going to run out of water, and it's something you can model. Whereas social vulnerability tends to be quite a complex context-specific thing. And I think if you want to understand who is vulnerable and who's going to be most at risk, you'd want to do a more in-depth, more of a qualitative type assessment. That said, you could have indicators like household income level, and you could a priori say, well, we think poorer people are going to be more vulnerable than richer people. That's defensible, although I think it's arguable that sometimes poorer people handle climate disasters better than richer people, I think. To develop an action plan, so once you've defined these thresholds, the idea is, of course, that the indicator reaches the threshold, it flags to subnational government that something needs to be done. So you'd have an action plan that would actually it would have the sort of the roles and responsibilities that would say, well, this is the action that needs to be done by whom, to take to where, and when the indicators reach this level. So there'd be time needed to develop that action plan. And then, of course, there's all the sausage making and important stuff of actually coordinating all of this, incentivizing government to actually do it, persuading them that it's important. Financing, again, we want to collect data that's already available, but there are time costs associated with having someone that's actually responsible for checking the websites and then calling up whoever's responsible to take actions. So quite a lot to be done in that space, actually. So we have about 20 minutes left. And for the last 20 minutes, I've got a Menti exercise. So if you go to menti.com on your device and enter in this code, if you can't read it, it's 82274256. And there's two questions on that Menti, and it's just reflecting on what you heard today and what you thought about today. One is what are the biggest challenges going forward that you see with sort of setting up, identifying indicators and setting up a program to monitor climate risks and respond to them. And then the second question on the Menti is, what do you see as the opportunities? Thinking about your country context or what you heard from your group today, what do you think are the opportunities? So take a few minutes to put in your ideas, and then we'll put them up on the screen here and see what people put in. And if you have any burning comments or questions, we'll have a bit of time to have some people discuss their thoughts and ask questions if you like. I'm going to navigate away from this slide. So last chance to get the code if you don't already have it. So first time challenges. operationalizing and ensuring context-specific indicators. Financing is up here a couple times, of course. Data management across agencies, the ministries. Yeah, I think it's a big one. I guess one thing I didn't mention in the talks that I think partnerships are quite important for accessing data that's already available. As I mentioned, I suspect many other sectors are interested in these same indicators. These aren't just WASH specific. And so you might just have like an agriculture NGO that's collecting this data. So if you're a WASH organization or a subnational government, how would you even come in contact with that agriculture NGO that might have that data? And one good way might be some countries have climate change coordination groups. You might have like the Ministry of Environment that has like a role in coordinating climate change across sectors. And those are good for platforms for forming partnerships. So if your country has one like that, you might try to join this, have WASH organizations join this group and say, hey, we're interested in these indicators. Does anyone in your sector currently monitor these things? And of course, you could share your data with them because they're probably very interested in it as well if you're collecting that data or if you have it. Lack of accurate climate forecasting. Yes, absolutely. Coherence between climate data and models, data availability. We've talked about obtaining government buy-in is a good one. If anyone has any comments. Does anyone want to share, elaborate on any one of their comments or anything they're seeing here? Yes, please.
I made a comment about increasing gaps in historical records. So it's been my experience in a number of places around the world that we were actually on groundwater professionals, so talking about groundwater data, we were actually really quite good at doing it in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, even if it was sort of manual data. And as we've moved to collecting data remotely via automatic sensing, we've actually got quite bad at doing the manual data, which you kind of need the calibration, but even just filling the gaps where you've done, whether it breaks and doesn't work, or someone forgets to change the battery or whatever. And so actually we've been underfunding the manual data collection, and those gaps in historical record are getting bigger, and you can't build them.
Yeah,
So,
interesting.
yeah,
I've heard
that's
about that.
happening in developed countries as well as and then come
I
back.
can imagine. Does anyone else would like to share a comment on challenges? Yeah, in the back. Sorry, we have a microphone, I think. Is this? Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, thanks.
Yeah, one of the challenges that I did share is the policy and regulatory framework that allows for smooth data sharing across public agencies. And I say that because coming from Kenya and having worked in a number of African countries, I see a situation where public institutions not only do not speak to one another, but also intentionally hoard their data. And so the situation is bad to the extent that agency A would probably never share with agency X unless they buy, and even if they buy, the data sets that is given to them is sometimes in a format that is not just useful to them. And so this leads to two major challenges. One is duplication of effort, which ends up consuming a lot of resources, because I have to generate the same set of information that you do have, and simply because we can't share. That is one. And two, that using this data to then inform planning and action becomes a challenge, because then the issue of data contestation as to whose data is superior and should be used becomes another issue, even if you generate. And so that having a concise policy framework and probably regulatory that allows public agencies to share data and probably manage and use that data to inform policy and other action planning is very important.
Yeah, great. Thanks. That's a really good comment. I think that, yeah, it's almost need a political economy analysis to sort out like all the competitive issues over data ownership. As you said, like, again, to go back to the sort of climate change partnerships, there was sort of an understanding and a policy framework to say that we're all using this data as part of climate change adaptation and resilience measures. That perhaps could be a sort of a platform or a framework for sharing data. there any other comments on challenges? Otherwise, we'll go to the opportunities slides. Nothing online. Oops, this clicker doesn't work for Brown,
That is what it will lose.
There we go, yeah. Oh, yeah, it's not a PowerPoint, it's just a browser.
Oh,
So that's- yeah. So opportunities, to mention new technologies, new technology platforms. In my group, we were talking about how there's remote surveillance technologies where they can monitor water resources with kind of like satellite technology, and a lot of organizations are putting up websites that they can actually monitor surface water and stream flows. And I've even heard groundwater somehow with satellite data. So those new technologies are making that kind of data more available. The NGOs collect a lot of data that can be used. So someone said developing guidance and threshold fractions, as we talked about. Networks and collaborations we just talked about, I think is really important for unlocking access to new data sources. As we had in our group, integrating questions into existing monitoring systems and advocating for indicators that we think are useful to collect. Does anyone want to comment on something they put into the slides here or that they're observing? Or if there's any folks online, you can answer into a chat box. Wrestling data from the private sector, you have mining sector, water utilities.
I guess I'll go.
Yeah.
So I've heard about GIS data being massive. I'm a GIS professional and, oh, thank you, sorry. I'm a GIS professional, and so there's tons of Earth observation data that is highly temporal, it's objective, that we're not utilizing enough to look at risks. And one of the things is, I've seen a lot about centralized data platforms, and oh my gosh, wouldn't that make everybody's life easier? One of the biggest things in Ghana when COVID hit was nobody had an inventory of all of the water, and how can you assess climate risks to infrastructure when you don't know where the infrastructure is? So having all of this stuff mapped out and you know, in the planning entities and departments and across the different agencies would just be massive, I think. And integrating climate indicators to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't actually make sense to silo all this data, and as we mentioned, the fact that duplicating efforts and everyone has their own data sets for each sector or each organization. Because again, these are quite generic and would apply across different organizations and sectors, so having something central probably makes most sense. Any other questions or comments before we wrap up? If not, we can probably take an early mark. The last thing I'll put up here is I mentioned we've been working on this output where we're sort of developing this list of indicators. And it has a bit more information about what I talked about, defining thresholds, developing an action plan and things like that. So that's not ready yet. That's going to be published later this year. But if you're interested, this link right here, it'll just take you to a survey and you can punch in your email address if you're interested in a copy. So once we get that published, I'll just look at the list of email addresses and I'll just send it out if you're interested in having that input, that output. So that's all I've got. I think we can take an early mark. Thanks very much, guys. I really enjoyed talking about that with you today. But if you don't want your sheets of paper, you can just leave them up front and I'll take care of them. Thank you.